Let's get started. Story number 1.
The snowstorm had been forecasted for days, but I never expected it to be this intense. I had planned this trip for months, a solo winter camping adventure in the mountains. The idea of being alone in the wilderness, surrounded by nothing but snow, trees, and the silence of nature, had always intrigued me. It was supposed to be peaceful, a way to disconnect from the stress of life. But nothing about this trip felt peaceful. I arrived at the trailhead early in the morning, with plenty of daylight to spare. The snow had already started to fall, a soft dusting at first, nothing to be concerned about. The hike to the campsite wasn't long, just a few miles up a mountain trail, but the increasing snow made the going slow. By the time I reached the clearing where I planned to set up camp, the snowfall had become heavier. The wind had started to pick up too, whistling through the trees, making the snow sting against my skin. I set up my tent quickly, trying to ignore the biting cold that was beginning to seep in. The trail had been empty, and I hadn't seen anyone since I left the parking lot. I wasn't surprised. Winter camping is always a solitary experience. After setting up the tent, I went about preparing for the night. I built a small fire, carefully shielded from the wind, and ate some food while I watched the snow swirl around me. As the night fell, the wind began to howl. The fire was barely holding on against the cold, and I soon retreated into my tent, zippered up tight to keep the warmth in. The howling wind outside seemed endless, but eventually I fell into a restless sleep. It was in the middle of the night that I woke up to the sound of movement outside my tent. At first, I thought it was just the wind shifting snow or branches creaking under the weight of the storm, but the noise was too deliberate. Footsteps, crunching in the snow. They weren't close, but they were getting closer. I froze. The only thing I could hear was my own breath, shallow and fast. The footsteps were still out there, slow and careful, moving around my tent. Whoever it was, they weren't making any attempt to hide the fact that they were there. My mind raced. It was too late for anyone to be out hiking in this weather, and no one had passed me on the trail. I sat up slowly, not wanting to make a sound. The footsteps stopped for a moment, and I held my breath, straining to hear anything else. There was nothing. Absolute silence. Then I heard it, someone whispering. It was faint, but distinct. My name. Matthew. I recoiled, my heart thumping in my chest. I wanted to shout out to demand who was out there, but I couldn't bring myself to make a sound. Another whisper. Matthew. I grabbed my flashlight, my hands shaking. I slowly unzipped the tent, just a crack, trying to peer through the snowstorm. Nothing. The night was pitch black, the snowfall so thick that I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. I slammed the zipper shut, heart racing. I had to be imagining things. Maybe it was the storm playing tricks on me. The isolation, the cold, it was getting to me. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I tried to go back to sleep, but it was impossible. Every sound outside made me tense. The footsteps. The whispers. Something wasn't right. I lay there waiting for the night to pass, my mind spinning with every possible explanation. Nothing made sense. At some point, exhaustion overcame me and I must have drifted into a fitful sleep. But it wasn't peaceful. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure in the snowstorm standing just outside the tent, staring. I woke up several times throughout the night, each time with the same oppressive feeling, like someone was standing just out of view, watching me. By morning, the snow had stopped falling, but the storm still raged in my head. I packed up quickly, more out of nervous energy than anything else. I wanted to leave to get back to civilization, but the storm had made the trail nearly impassable. The deep snow and drifts had covered my path, and it was slow going as I made my way down the mountain. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure from the night before, but there was nothing. The trail was empty, the woods eerily quiet. I made it back to the trailhead by late afternoon, exhausted and relieved. The car was still there, parked at the edge of the clearing. I threw my gear in the back, shaking off the cold and the unease that had followed me since the moment I set foot on that mountain. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. How could I? No one would believe me. It was just a strange encounter, maybe a hallucination caused by the isolation. After all, I'd been out there alone for days. I'd been cold, tired, and hungry. The storm had played tricks on my mind, But the whispers, the footsteps, they didn't feel like a trick of the mind. They felt real. And the worst part? The worst part was the man I saw as I was driving out of the mountain pass. I had just passed the clearing near the trailhead when I saw him, standing there in the snow just past the edge of the forest. He was tall, thin, with a hooded jacket that obscured most of his face. His posture was strange, stiff, like he wasn't sure what he was doing. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind raced. Who was that? He shouldn't have been there. The nearest town was miles away, and the mountain pass was empty. I backed the car up, my fingers gripped tightly on the steering wheel. But when I looked again, he was gone. Nothing but the snow-covered trees. I haven't been camping since that night. Every time I close my eyes, I hear the whispers in the wind, feel the cold breath of that figure watching me. I don't know what it was out there or who that man was, but I don't plan on ever finding out. Story the end.
Story number 2.
It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a chance to unwind from the hustle of city life and reconnect with nature. My brother, Jake, and I had planned the trip for months. We were both experienced campers, but neither of us had ever ventured into the wild in the middle of winter. The forecast called for a snowstorm, but we weren't intimidated. We knew the area well, a remote spot in the foothills of the Adirondacks, where we'd camped countless times in the summer. I had no idea then that this trip would change everything. We left on a Friday afternoon, our backpacks loaded with gear, sleeping bags, a small tent, food, and enough layers of clothing to keep us warm through the cold. The drive was smooth until we neared the mountain pass. The snow had started falling heavily by then, but the roads were still clear. Jake was driving, his eyes focused on the road, while I gazed out the window, watching the world slowly turn white. We were both excited, eager for the adventure ahead, but as we drove deeper into the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. By the time we reached the trailhead, the snow was falling in thick, heavy flakes, and the wind had begun to pick up. We parked the truck and began unloading our gear, the cold biting at our fingers. The trail was already covered with a thick layer of snow, and the trees were bending under the weight of the accumulating ice. It was beautiful, in a way, but also a little eerie. "We should make it to the campsite before it gets too dark," Jake said, pulling his gloves on. "Yeah, let's go," I replied, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my chest. We hiked for about an hour, the snow crunching under our boots, our breath coming out in clouds. The further we went, the more isolated the trail seemed. There was no one else around, just the two of us, the ever-deepening snow, and the sound of the wind whipping through the trees. By the time we reached the clearing where we planned to set up camp, it was nearly dark. The snowstorm was relentless, and the wind howled through the trees, making it difficult to hear anything else. We quickly set up the tent, trying to shield it from the worst of the wind, then built a fire in the small pit we had dug earlier. The flames crackled, sending warmth through our clothes, but the wind kept whipping the snow into our faces, making it hard to relax. After a simple dinner of freeze-dried meals, we sat by the fire, trying to enjoy the evening despite the growing storm. The world outside the firelight was pitch black, the snow obscuring everything beyond a few feet. It felt as if we were the only people on Earth, stranded in a frozen wilderness. "I've got a bad feeling about this," I admitted, breaking the silence. Jake raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean? It's just a snowstorm. We've camped in worse." "I know," I replied, rubbing my hands together, "but it feels wrong. The air is too still, you know?" Jake looked at me, then glanced around the campsite, as if trying to pick up on whatever it was I was feeling. "You're just spooked by the storm. It's fine. We'll be all right." I wanted to believe him, but the unease gnawed at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, that we weren't as alone as we thought. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just the isolation and the storm playing tricks on my mind. As the night wore on, we retreated to the tent, the fire burning low behind us. The wind continued to howl outside, shaking the walls of the tent. We tried to sleep, but every gust of wind seemed to bring with it an unnerving noise, like the sound of something brushing against the tent. At one point, I woke up to a soft thudding noise, like something was walking just outside the fabric. My heart raced as I lay there, frozen in place, straining to listen. "Jake," I whispered. He didn't answer. I shook him awake, my voice trembling. "Jake, there's something outside." He groggily sat up, looking around the dark tent. "What are you talking about?" "I heard footsteps," I said, my voice barely audible. "I swear I heard someone walking around outside." Jake stared at me for a moment, then got out of the sleeping bag. "It's probably just the wind or an animal. There's nothing out there." He unzipped the tent flap and stuck his head out, scanning the area. I could see the dim glow of the campfire still flickering in the distance, casting long shadows on the snow. But there was nothing else, no movement, no sign of anything unusual. "See?" he said, climbing back into the tent. "Nothing." But I wasn't convinced. The noise had been too distinct, too purposeful. I had the sinking feeling that something had been out there, watching us. I tried to dismiss it, but the thought lingered in the back of my mind as I lay back down, trying to sleep. The storm raged on, but eventually I managed to drift off. I don't know how much time passed, but I woke again to the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside the tent. This time they were much closer. I shot up, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached over to shake Jake awake, but before I could, I heard the unmistakable sound of something brushing against the side of the tent. It was soft, but deliberate. "Jake," I whispered urgently. He groggily stirred. "What now?" "Someone's outside," I said, my voice shaking. "I heard them again. They're right outside." Jake seemed more alert now. He reached for the flashlight and unzipped the flap, peering out. But again, there was nothing. "This is crazy," he muttered. "You're just freaking yourself out." But I wasn't so sure. The hair on the back of my neck was standing on end, and my instincts were telling me something was wrong. I had never felt so certain of something in my life. There was no wind to explain the noises anymore. The world outside the tent was still, almost unnaturally quiet. "We're leaving," I said, my voice firm. Jake didn't argue. He could see the fear in my eyes. We quickly packed up our things, moving as quietly as possible. The wind had died down, but the snow had started to fall again, thick and heavy, blanketing everything in white. As we packed, I felt the weight of being watched more than ever. It was like someone was standing just out of sight, waiting for us to make a move. We didn't say much as we hiked back down the trail, the storm still raging around us. The air was thick with snow, and the world felt impossibly quiet. The further we went from the campsite, the less I felt like we were being followed. But I couldn't shake the sensation of someone or something lurking just beyond the reach of the storm. By the time we reached the truck, the storm had intensified and the road was nearly impassable. We didn't speak much as we drove away, heading back to civilization. But I kept glancing nervously at the rearview mirror, expecting to see something or someone behind us. When we finally got home, I thought maybe the whole experience had been a figment of my imagination, a product of the isolation, the storm, and the cold. But I knew deep down that something had happened out there in the woods. I don't know what it was. I don't know if it was a ghost, a person, or something else entirely. But I know I'll never forget the way it felt to be out there, in the heart of that snowstorm, knowing we weren't alone. Story, the end.
Story number 3.
I had never been one to believe in ghost stories. I was a seasoned camper, used to roughing it in the mountains, and I always trusted my instincts over folklore. But one night, during a winter camping trip that took an unexpected turn, I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew. It was early December when I decided to take a solo camping trip in the high country. I had been hiking in these mountains for years, but I'd never been out here alone in the winter. It was the quiet I craved, the kind of stillness that the winter snow brings when the forest feels like it belongs to no one and nothing. The forecast had called for a snowstorm, but I wasn't worried. I was prepared, an experienced outdoorsman who had been through countless storms. The snow was supposed to start in the evening, and I planned to be tucked into my tent before it really picked up. The drive to the trailhead took longer than expected, and by the time I set up camp, the snow was already starting to fall. Thick, heavy flakes, swirling in the wind, reduced visibility to almost nothing. I didn't mind. The isolation was exactly what I was looking for. By the time the sun set, the snow was coming down fast. I built a fire in the fire pit near my tent and wrapped myself in layers, sitting back to enjoy the warmth. The storm howled around me, the wind pushing the snow into drifts that quickly built up against my tent. The fire crackled, providing a small, comforting contrast to the bleakness of the night. As the evening wore on, I began to feel the weight of the storm outside. The wind intensified, its howls turning into sharp gusts that seemed to shake the very ground beneath me. But inside my tent, I felt safe. I settled in for the night, making sure my sleeping bag was secure and my food and water were within reach. But sleep didn't come easily. Around midnight, the wind picked up again. It rattled my tent more forcefully than before, and I could hear the snow battering against the fabric. The noise was constant, but it wasn't the storm that kept me awake. It was the feeling that something was off, something I couldn't explain. I kept hearing noises, faint sounds from outside the tent. At first, it was just the occasional crunch of snow, something I brushed off as the wind shifting the snowdrifts around me. But the sounds grew more distinct. It was like someone or something was walking around the tent. I sat up, listening intently. The footsteps were slow, measured, as if whoever or whatever was out there was trying to be careful not to be heard. But the crunching snow was unmistakable. My heart began to race. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, moving through the snow. But the footsteps didn't sound like animal tracks. The rhythm was all wrong, too deliberate, too human. I grabbed my flashlight, holding it tightly as I unzipped the flap just enough to peer outside. The snowstorm had reduced visibility to just a few feet in front of me. The night was dark and thick, the snow falling in blinding sheets. I didn't see anything, just the swirling whiteness, and I quickly closed the flap again, my pulse racing. I tried to dismiss it. It was the storm playing tricks on me, I told myself. But the sounds didn't stop. They continued, slowly circling the perimeter of my tent, like someone walking in a slow, deliberate path around me. I wasn't sure how much time passed, maybe minutes, maybe hours, but the footsteps stopped for a moment, and in the silence that followed, I heard something else. A voice. A whisper, soft at first, carried by the wind. It was almost impossible to make out the words, but I could hear it clearly. "Help me." I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. The voice was so close, just beyond the tent, but I couldn't see anyone. I felt a chill run through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. I stayed completely still, my breath shallow, straining to hear. The voice came again, this time louder, clearer. "Help me." It was unmistakable. It was a human voice, weak, almost pleading. I didn't know what to do. I had heard of people getting lost in the mountains during storms, but it was so late, and the storm was so fierce that no one could be out there. My mind raced. What if it was someone who had gotten lost, stranded out there in the blizzard? But then a chilling thought crossed my mind. What if it wasn't someone at all? What if it was something else? I grabbed my knife and flashlight, the only things I had for protection, and unzipped the tent flap once again. This time, I didn't hesitate to shine the flashlight out into the darkness, my eyes scanning the snowdrifts, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was nothing there, just the snow and the howling wind. The voice had stopped. I stood frozen, staring into the darkness, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the swirling snow. I felt exposed, vulnerable. I knew I wasn't imagining it. I had heard the voice, and I had heard the footsteps. But there was no one out there now. I stayed outside for what felt like an eternity, scanning the area. But there was no movement, no footprints in the fresh snow, no sign of anyone. Eventually, I retreated back into my tent, my body tense, every muscle on edge. I didn't sleep at all that night. The wind howled, the snow continued to fall, and the eerie feeling of being watched never left me. When morning came, the snowstorm was still raging, but I was desperate to leave. I packed up my gear quickly, barely looking around as I hurried to break camp. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there with me that night, something unseen but very real. I made my way back down the mountain, the storm still falling around me, but my mind was elsewhere. My thoughts kept drifting back to the voice I had heard, the steps I had tracked in the snow, the cold whisper that had called out for help. I never told anyone what happened that night. Who would believe me? A seasoned camper, someone who had been alone in the mountains countless times, and yet that night I had experienced something I couldn't explain. To this day, I still don't know what it was. But when I think back to that night, I can still hear the voice. And I wonder, was it someone lost or was it something else? Something that had been waiting in the snowstorm, just for me.
Story number 4.
It was supposed to be an unforgettable experience, a weekend getaway into the wilds of Montana for a winter camping trip. My friend Alex and I had always talked about it, so when we finally made the decision, we were eager to escape the bustle of city life and embrace the quiet of the mountains. We'd both done plenty of camping before, but never in the dead of winter. This time was different. It was going to be a real challenge, and we were excited. What we didn't know was that this trip would become something neither of us would ever forget. The weather forecast had predicted light snow, so we packed our gear accordingly. Heavy-duty jackets, sturdy boots, sleeping bags rated for below-zero temperatures, and plenty of food and water. We arrived in the late afternoon, just as the sun was starting to set behind the thick trees of the national forest. The sky had turned a dull gray, and the temperature had already dropped below freezing. The air had a crisp bite to it, and the wind picked up as we made our way through the snow to set up camp. We chose a small clearing near a stream that wound its way through the forest. The snow was deep, and the landscape looked like a painting, untouched and serene. By the time we finished setting up our tents, the sky had darkened and the first few flakes began to fall. "Looks like it's going to be a real storm tonight," Alex commented, pulling his jacket tight as we huddled around the fire. "It's pretty peaceful now, but I wouldn't want to be caught out here in the middle of it." "Not going to happen," I said with a grin. "We're experts. A little snow never killed anyone." We laughed, but I couldn't ignore the gnawing unease that seemed to settle in my gut. The wind had picked up, rattling the tree branches above us. The fire crackled and popped, throwing odd shadows onto the snow. As we ate, the storm intensified, the snowflakes growing thicker, swirling in the night air. By 9 p.m., we had retreated to our tents. The temperature had dropped even further, and the wind howled through the trees, making the fabric of the tent rustle. I tried to fall asleep, but the eerie sound of the wind and the snow hitting the walls of the tent kept me awake. I tossed and turned, trying to ignore the feeling that something was off, but the quiet had an unnerving quality to it. At some point during the night, I heard something outside, footsteps crunching in the snow. It was a faint sound, but it was unmistakable. I lay still, straining my ears to listen. "Alex?" I whispered, but there was no answer. I could hear him breathing, deep and slow, from the other side of the tent. The footsteps continued, pacing in a slow, circular pattern around our camp. I wasn't sure if it was just the wind playing tricks on me, but it sounded like someone, or something, was walking deliberately in the snow, stopping every few steps, then starting again. I held my breath, waiting for the sound to stop, but it didn't. Instead, it grew louder. The footsteps seemed to be getting closer, but there was no sign of any animal or human outside. There were no headlights, nothing but the howling wind and the heavy snow. I reached over to wake Alex, but before I could move, the sound stopped. For several long moments, everything was silent. The wind still whistled through the trees, but the crunching of snow had ceased. I lay there, wide awake, my heart racing. Suddenly, a soft voice broke the stillness. A whisper, barely audible through the fabric of the tent. "Help. Me." I froze. The voice was so faint, I wasn't sure if I had imagined it, but it was clear enough to make my stomach churn. The words seemed to hang in the air just outside the tent. They weren't familiar, definitely not Alex's voice. I wanted to call out, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed, caught between disbelief and fear. The whispering continued, but this time it was more frantic. "Please. Help." I finally mustered the courage to shake Alex awake. He was groggy at first, but jolted upright when I whispered, "Did you hear that?" "What?" he asked, looking around. "Hear what?" "That voice. It's coming from outside." He stared at me for a moment, then grabbed the flashlight from his pack. We both sat there, straining our ears to listen. The wind howled, but no more whispers. "There's nothing out there," Alex said, but his voice trembled slightly. "It's probably just the wind." "I don't know," I said, my voice barely audible. It didn't sound like the wind. We both sat in silence, listening to the storm, but the whispers didn't come back. Eventually, exhaustion overcame me, and I drifted off into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, the storm had passed. The world outside was blanketed in a thick, pristine layer of snow, and the sky was overcast. We both woke up feeling exhausted and on edge, but we tried to shake it off. We weren't going to let a little weirdness ruin our trip. When we went outside to check on the camp, something felt wrong. The entire area around our tents was covered in fresh snow, but there were no tracks, no footprints, no signs that anyone had been there at all. The snow was perfect, undisturbed, as though nothing had moved through it since it had fallen. That's when I noticed the tree just beyond the clearing. It was large and twisted, the kind of tree that looks like it belongs in a haunted forest. But what made it worse was that something was hanging from it. A thin, tattered piece of cloth swaying in the wind. Alex and I both looked at each other, our faces pale. "That wasn't there last night," he whispered. We walked toward the tree cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. As we got closer, I saw it. The cloth wasn't just fabric. It was a shredded piece of what looked like a torn shirt. There was a faint, dried stain that resembled blood on the fabric. I could feel my legs shaking as we backed away. The unease from last night had turned into something much darker. Something was out there, something that shouldn't have been. We decided to pack up and leave, but even as we hastily gathered our things, the feeling of being watched didn't leave. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the snow had me jumping. It was as though the forest itself was alive, aware of us, and angry that we had intruded. As we made our way back to the truck, we glanced back once, just to make sure nothing was following us. There was nothing to see, just the swirling snow in the distance. But that's when I saw it. Something dark moving between the trees, too fast for it to be a person or an animal. I didn't mention it to Alex, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us out of the woods. We left the mountain without looking back, but to this day, when I'm alone in the woods, I still hear the whispering. It's faint, just a breath on the wind, but it's there, calling to me. Help me. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The wind had been picking up steadily throughout the day, but it wasn't until the evening that it turned into something truly terrifying. I had planned the camping trip for weeks, looking forward to a few days of solitude and quiet in the mountains. I'd been camping in the winter before, so I felt confident I could handle the conditions. I was wrong. The first day had been peaceful, though chilly. The sky was overcast, and snow had been falling lightly as I hiked up to my chosen campsite. I set up camp in a small clearing, surrounded by dense trees that would offer some shelter from the wind. The snow had covered the ground in a thick white blanket, muffling the world around me. The cold air bit at my skin as I worked, but I was prepared, sheltered by the warmth of my winter gear, a well-stocked backpack, and a sturdy tent. That night, as I settled into my sleeping bag, the wind began to pick up. It was more than just a breeze. It howled through the trees, sending the snow swirling in violent gusts. The tent shuddered with each gust, and the fabric pressed tightly against me. I could hear the whistling sound of the wind, followed by the rhythmic tapping of snow against the tent walls. The fire I had built outside had long since been snuffed out by the storm, and now I was completely alone in the cold, dark wilderness. The feeling of isolation was intense, but I had always enjoyed being alone in nature. I was used to it. As I lay there drifting in and out of sleep, I suddenly woke to the sound of something strange. It wasn't the wind. It was a soft, rhythmic thudding like footsteps in the snow. I was instantly awake, heart pounding, straining to listen. There was no way anyone could be out here. I was miles from the nearest trail, and the weather had been so bad that no sane person would have ventured out. I lay there, holding my breath, trying to make sense of the noise. It wasn't the wind or the snow. It was definitely footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through the deep snow outside my tent. My first instinct was to call out, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the fact that I was alone, or maybe it was just fear. Whatever it was, I stayed silent, too afraid to even move. The footsteps grew closer. I could hear them coming around the side of the tent now, and my mind raced. What was I supposed to do? Should I call out? Should I grab my knife and confront whoever was out there? But there was something else that was bothering me, something I couldn't explain. I noticed that the steps weren't consistent. They weren't like someone walking naturally through the snow. They seemed almost deliberate, as though the person, if it was a person, was trying to sneak around, moving in odd, hesitant steps. Then, as I lay there, I heard something else. A voice. Low, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. Help me. It was soft, almost like the wind carrying the words to me, but it was unmistakable. The voice was coming from just outside the tent. Panic seized me. The voice sounded desperate, but there was an eerie quality to it, as though it were being spoken from some distant, unnatural place. I didn't know what to think. I couldn't explain it, but the voice felt wrong. My mind was racing now, heart pounding in my chest. Should I call out and try to help? Should I stay hidden and wait for whoever it was to leave? Every instinct told me to stay quiet, to just wait, but curiosity gnawed at me. My hands trembled as I slowly unzipped the tent flap just a few inches, peeking outside. The storm was still raging. The snow was falling heavily, and the wind blew it in all directions, reducing visibility to almost nothing. I saw nothing, just the white blur of snow and trees, the world obscured in a thick blanket of white. But then, as I pulled my head back inside, I saw something. Or rather, I felt something. A presence. I couldn't explain it, but it was as though something was standing just outside, watching me. It felt cold, colder than the snowstorm itself. It was an unnatural chill that crawled under my skin, settling in my bones. I froze, unsure of what to do. The footsteps had stopped, but the feeling remained. I felt my chest tighten with fear. There was something wrong here, something not right. And yet there was a part of me that still wanted to believe it was nothing, a figment of my imagination. But then I heard the voice again. Help me, please. It was closer this time, so close that I almost thought the person, if it was a person, was right outside, whispering through the fabric of the tent. I jumped, nearly knocking my flashlight off the ground. My hand fumbled for it, and when I finally turned it on, I realized how foolish I had been to think I could ignore the fear. I pointed the light at the tent wall, but it was no use. The beam barely cut through the thick snowfall outside. The feeling of being watched intensified. I slowly crawled out of my sleeping bag, my hands shaking. I grabbed my knife from the side of the tent, just in case. I had no idea what was out there, but I had to be ready for anything. I pulled open the flap of the tent just enough to slip outside. The wind hit me immediately, stinging my face with the icy cold. I turned on my flashlight, scanning the area. The snow was falling so heavily that I could barely see a few feet in front of me, but there was something out there, something in the distance. A figure standing motionless just past the tree line. I couldn't make out any features, but I knew I wasn't imagining it. The shape was tall, thin, almost skeletal, and it stood in complete stillness, as if waiting for me to notice. My breath caught in my throat as I took a step back, instinctively retreating toward the safety of my tent. But when I turned to go back inside, I froze. There, standing just a few feet away from me, was another figure. Just as tall, just as thin. I couldn't move. My heart raced, and every part of me screamed to run, but my legs felt like they were frozen in place. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. In that moment, I knew in the deepest, most primal part of my being that I was not alone in the woods. I had never been alone. Something had been watching me since I arrived, something that wasn't human. With a burst of adrenaline, I shoved past the figure, stumbling back toward the tent. I didn't look back, didn't stop to question what was happening. I just ran. I dove into the tent, zipping it shut behind me as quickly as I could. My breath came in ragged gasps as I crouched in the dark, clutching my knife and trying to silence the pounding of my heart. The storm outside raged on, but inside the tent I could hear nothing but the sound of my own breathing. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I couldn't sleep, couldn't stop staring at the tent walls, convinced the figures were still out there. Eventually the storm eased, but I didn't feel safe. I waited until dawn broke, the first light of day revealing the full extent of the snowstorm. But when I looked outside, there were no footprints, no sign of anyone, just the fresh, undisturbed snow. I never found any trace of the figures or heard the voice again. I packed up my things as quickly as I could and left the campsite behind, not caring if the storm was still there or if I could make it back to civilization. I didn't want to be in those woods for another minute. I never went back. Story the end.